I've got 10 o'clock, and since it's being recorded, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to part 4 of our Windows 10 webinar series presented by Model Technology Solutions. If you've missed parts 1, 2, or 3, I'd recommend go back and watching them. They're all posted on our YouTube channel. In addition, there's a lot of information in there, from everything from business value propositions to new security features to the tooling around Windows 10. So lots of good information out there to kind of watch. To level set some of the expectations for this presentation, the goal here is to provide an overview of how to manage Windows 10 as a service, and through that we'll define what that means, and we'll talk about the tooling and some other pieces to it. But one thing I want to make very clear up front is there's no right or wrong way to do this, right? There's what works best for your environment, following a general set of guidelines. And so we'll talk today about those guidelines. We'll talk about how that could fit into your organization. And we should have plenty of time left over at the end for questions. So if you have them, go ahead and save them to the end. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into the agenda. All right, so we'll go through an introduction of Model Technology and then who I am. We'll talk about Windows as a service and what that means to us and what that means for your organizations kind of ongoing. We'll talk about how to operationalize those deployments. It's a little different than how it used to be when you were going from XP to 7 or 7 to 8 or 7 to 10. And then we'll talk about upgrade readiness and what that means from an application perspective, a driver perspective, and how to get your hands around that within the organization. We'll also go through a demo, and then we'll talk a little Q&A. So like I said, we should have plenty of time at the end. So if you have a lot of questions, love to have them. And something I can't answer, certainly can take it offline. So a little bit about Model. So we're a consulting organization and managed service organization. Those are our two different arms that we have. On the consulting side, we have a team of experts that come into an organization and can fast track a lot of learning for you. So whether it's OMS related, EMS, anything in the System Center realm, or Windows 10, our consultants have been through a lot of those projects and can certainly fast track them for your organization. On the managed services side, we look at ourselves as an extension of your team for managing different components and different technologies, such as Azure DSC for server build processes, or anything in the System Center stack. There's an abundance of reporting, a portal to open up incidents with our team, and certainly SLAs wrapped around that. And what we found is we can offload a lot of some of the mundane tasks, either image servicing or patching, things like that, and allow your engineers really to focus on driving your business and get out of some of the lights on pieces. Overall, we stay very much in our areas of expertise, and we really specialize in building the right solution for your organization from tool sets. We're a Microsoft partner a couple times over. Let's go into a little bit about me. So I'm the managing partner of Model Technology Solutions. My name is Jason Rutherford. I've been in IT now for over 16 years. I now have a couple of kids and a lovely wife. I am a CrossFit enthusiast. And what seems like a long time ago, I was the technical editor of the Mastering System Center Config Man R2 book by Cybex. And then more recently, just last year, I was a contributor on the white paper that Microsoft released called the Release Pipeline Model, which really focuses on Microsoft's view of DevOps and how to apply that. So let's jump into the Windows as a service and kind of what that means to us as stewards of IT. So you've probably seen this slide before. There's a couple of different updates and I guess labels that they're calling updates as it applies to Windows 10. So we have feature updates, which are on the left, and those will be 2 to 3 times per year. I think we're more geared on the 2 times per year. If you look at 1703 and 1709 that's coming down the pipe, those would be the 2 feature updates. And then we have monthly cumulative quality updates, which are more like patches. And so if we take a look at the feature updates and we think in terms of operating system releases, this is going to be the new standard moving forward, which starting with 1511 and 1610 and 1703 and 1709. Those are now the new versions of the client operating system. So you're probably used to having Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, very different editions and a different look and feel. And Microsoft has pretty much retired that kind of line of thinking and moving into a feature update model that's coming out. We'll talk more about the release cadence, but 2 to 3 times per year. The quality updates, the infographic there on the right, it's more your hot fixes and security patches kind of all rolled together. So even if a PC has been offline for a very long time, the theory is you'd only need install one update to bring it up to the patch level. So patching is still a thing that you have to do. None of this is going to negate patch management in an organization just yet, but the idea is to make it simpler to do so. If we take a look at the feature releases, as Microsoft calls them, so you may have been familiar with what was formerly called Current Branch and Current Business Branch, and Microsoft has really retired that those naming standards, and a lot of their technology is still reflected, so it can be very confusing. But the idea is that you have 18 months in total that you'll be able to use a build, right? So if we kind of simplify some things and put it in JSON terms, we have 1703. So from the time the 1703 went into a general population state, you have 18 months from that point to use 1703 and to do your daily functions on it. And then at the end of that 18 months, the idea is that you're going to stop being able to patch that operating system. So that's a big thing that I think is a pretty big takeaway from a lot of these conversations I've been having lately, which is the release cadence of these feature updates is important to understand new features and what's coming down the pipe. But almost even more important than that is understanding that they end of life much, much sooner, right? So there's some general guidance and general guidelines of how to get this deployed in your organization in such a small time frame. But if you were to look at it, the idea is that every spring and fall, they're going to release a new version of the operating system. So if you take 1703 and 1709, spring and fall, you'll have a couple of different iterations of the operating system available. 1703, for example, 1709, and then enter in 1803, we'll call it. Not really sure what the next edition is. May or may not be published yet. But you'll be able to essentially skip an edition and move very quickly to get on to the other edition. So there's some options in how you want to approach this with your organization. And again, as I stated in the very beginning, it's not going to be the same for every organization. So you do have the potential to skip a release, but at the end of the 18 months, you have to keep in mind that you're not going to be able to patch the operating system any longer. The updates will not be applicable. So if you had the idea that you're going to deploy Windows 10, 15, 11, and you're just going to, that's good, you've got Windows 10 out in the organization for a couple years, that's going to be problematic because here before too long, which I believe is November, 1511 ends of life. It will end of life. So you're not going to be able to patch 1511 very, very soon. So what you used to do in every 2 to 3 to 4 year cadence, which was roll out a new operating system, you'll need to incorporate that or operationalize that in a once to twice a year project. And we'll talk about how to operationalize that, but I want to make sure that just being clear that there is a limited window that you'll have operating system support, and that window is about 18 months. So now that everybody's kind of on the same page with what Windows 10 is going to look like moving forward, we need to talk about, well, how do we operationalize it, right? How do we take what was a transition from a larger project that we did every couple of years, and how do we break that down to something we do every year? And you may have seen this slide in one of my previous webinars, but in the olden days, 2000 to say, we'll even call it up to 2014, 15, you'd go through a long planning phase on a project, right? And then you'd go through an even longer deployment phase of the project. And this infographic really depicts what it looks like from a total effort perspective, talking about applications, the infrastructure, the actual imaging component, the deployment. Over the years, it's been optimized some. It may have been a reduced effort here and there with some automation. Maybe ZTI was entered in at some point. But overall, it was a lot of effort to go through. And so trying to wrap our heads around the idea that we need to do this once a year can be difficult and can be a little frustrating. But one of the things that you'll note that I believe this is a graphic potentially for Microsoft, I don't recall. But this graphic really depicts, maybe not in its true truth, but it is much easier to deploy the operating system, to upgrade the infrastructure and the apps around it than it ever has been. And so we're going to take a look at that today. And while it may be true that it's easier to go through the processes for deployment, there's a couple of things I don't want everyone to lose sight of. Communication plans about the upgrade are just as important as ever, right? Updating the tools that surround the build, such as group policy objects or the SCCM infrastructure to be able to properly manage. That is also a piece that we cannot take for granted. And then finally, the application compatibility through testing, through testing. Sorry, I was just reading. It looks like slides are changing on their own. Is everybody up to up on the right slide? Should be an infographic about deployment effort. Okay, so application compatibility testing. While the operating system updates, the feature releases are minimal and different than they used to be from a major operating system upgrade release, that this process still needs to take place. The kind of the lifeblood of your organization is your applications and the user's productivity, right? And so when you think of that in terms of making sure that that still operates, application compatibility testing is still critical to the processes. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to get your hands around that. So everyone should have a slide up now that kind of depicts what Microsoft's view of a new deployment would look like, or kind of their general guidelines to how to approach these different groups as it pertains to feature updates and quality updates. And I've added a couple of things to simplify it. So Microsoft calls it preview, targeted, broad, and kind of critical as their terminology they go. But if you were to look at it, kind of the terminology that at least that I'm familiar with, test, pilot, production, and then maybe sensitive systems or white glove systems, we'll call it, right? And they even have an aggressive, what I would believe to be an aggressive kind of quality updates. So the monthly patches, so 7 to 14 days for production. Love to see everybody there, but there certainly may be some delays in getting that out the door. And then critical systems are 30 days past. So, you know, it's an ideal state, but it may not work for every organization, kind of as I stated in the very beginning. But if we take a look at the deferral for feature updates, this is an important lesson that we're all going to have to try to consume and interpret for what this means for our organization. We're going to need to, at some point, go through a preview or a test in the Windows Insider program. And so my recommendation for this is typically some IT folks. And what they're really looking to do is they're looking to understand the new features of the build while they're in the Windows Insider program, right, as much as available to them, and see if they're applicable to their environment or if they need to manage them differently, right? So do they need to put in new group policies? Do they need to update SCCM to manage these features? And a good example of that would be Device Guard and the SCCM management of it, right? Is that something you want to deploy in your infrastructure? So at some point you have to test and kind of review what new features are in the actual operating systems coming down the pipe. Once you've got some of the framework in place, and we'll call the framework, you know, maybe the group policies to control the new features and some things turned off at a very minimum, then it goes into a targeted group, which could be a pilot group. And the way that I interpret this is really you have to start getting application compatibility sign off. So as you're going into the rolling out phase and deployment phase, you know, maybe you're a month into the preview and test and it just went GA. Maybe it's time to actually move it into the application compatibility testers, where you give it to the application owners, you have them test their critical apps. Maybe it's a handful of apps, maybe it's many more apps than that. But you have them evaluate the release before you ever hit broad deployment or production deployment. That'll give you, and I would recommend some kind of formal sign-off as well from an application and a compatibility perspective. As good as we are at IT, we don't know everything about the applications or how it behaves or how people use it, right? So what we need to make sure of is that the user experience isn't significantly impacted while the applications still remain operational before it ever goes into production. And so that may take a couple of months to get through that process or that phase of it. And then it goes into broad production, right? And so if you looked at Microsoft's recommendation, they have production starts at 120 days past release. that may or may not work for your organization. That may or may not be right for what you're trying to accomplish. But we're going to summarize this here on the next slide. And then you have the critical or the white glove systems. Maybe it's people that aren't as adaptable to new technology, or maybe it's really critical systems that you're not sure is going to work. You don't have a way to test the software. That might be a better suited for a different servicing branch rather than what's out in the semi-annual. So if I were to summarize some of this, take and deploy your most adaptable users first and deploy to your least adaptable users last, if you're going to do it in a stepped cadence, right? And again, this is just one way to interpret the slides that Microsoft had put together on their site, but it's similar to deployment groups that were basically put together for major upgrades or deployments that you're used to. You would go with IT friendlies first. You would then move to the people that are a little more difficult or maybe technologically challenged, right? But so you simply want to separate machine deployments by timeline is one recommendation, because as you're going through the deployments and as you're kind of filtering out, making sure that all the applications are compatible, that all the infrastructure works as expected, that no new features are hindering any productivity at work, you want to do that over a timeline, right? It may not be suitable to just flash cut everybody all at once, and certainly wouldn't be my recommendation. So let's take a look at a strategy for this and try to put a little bit more tread to it, right? So you have a test group, and again, this is the early adopter of the preview build. So you have IT admins in this group, and you learn the new feature sets and you determine applicability for your environment. You also do things like you update the ADMLs and ADMXs for GPOs, maybe you update SCCM at that time, and you put all the pieces in place needed to manage this release accordingly. Once it goes to a GA, you really need to go to the application testers, and this again should have some kind of formal sign-off process to say that our mission critical applications do in fact work. And I wouldn't leave this all to the application owners. We'll talk about some of the tools that you can use to identify any known applications using the Microsoft OMS application upgrade advisor. So we'll look at that. But once all the application testers have given you a green light, or your super users, or however you want to deem them, then you can start your pilot group. So your IT friendlies, right? A sampling of all your business units. So whether you're manufacturing or your retail, get a sampling of all the different environments that you have, call it a pilot group, call it, make sure they're friendly to IT and provide feedback to make sure that it's going to be a smooth rollout in production. And at this point, the business group or the business unit owners ideally would have some kind of sign off to say that, yep, our business unit can still function under this version of Windows before you roll out to production. Then you can start your production rollout to most adaptable users, then the people that are adaptable to some degree, and then the people that may require a little more attention or may not be as adaptable. So that's one strategy overall, right? Now, there's been another talk of a different strategy that I'm kind of fond of as well, which is a different strategy would be very similar to the first one. You have a test group for IT admins to, again, learn the new feature sets and determine the applicability. Same piece, you update all the outlying infrastructure. When it goes to GA, you go to the application testers, that's the same. Pilot group, get the IT friendlies, sample business units, same. Then at the end of it, instead of rolling it out in different groups, you basically give it out to the entire production organization as an available update. So if you think about it in terms of phones, when your phone has an update, you get a little red squiggly 1 over the settings if you're on the Apple device, and you go in there and you punch it in at some point, you install the update. So very similar to that, you basically give the users the ability to self-service the updates. And so you can do it all at once and let them kind of choose what is convenient for them. This way, you're not necessarily dealing with all of the scheduling nightmare that may happen with trying to control the different groups, trying to do it without impacting their day. But this way is also going to require a whole lot of communication. This might be a change for how you do business in your organization, might be a change for how you roll things out. But the idea is that all users have the ability to upgrade at this moment, and then you have to give them a deadline, right? And so after 60 days, On day 60, day 61, it's going to install, but there's communication after communication, letting everybody know everything kind of along the way. And so, again, these are just two different views of how to incorporate this. And I realize that operationalizing this in many organizations is going to be an undertaking. And these are meant to give you some ideas to spark how to get this moving in your organization to what fits for you, because neither one of these may fit or one of them might work for you. But there are some tools that can accomplish the actual tactical work of rolling out Windows 10 and the updates for Windows 10. So there's Windows Update standalone. There's Windows Update for Business, which is basically deferring quality and feature updates according to a company policy that are not managed by WSUS. And then you have WSUS and SCCM. We'll take a quick look at the comparison, because I do want to get into the demo and explain some more of the tactical things, as we do have this staged as a more technical conversation. So if we take a look at the servicing tools such as Windows Update, you can defer it. It's a manual defer. You basically go to Settings, Windows Update. You can tell it how long you want to pause deferred updates or feature updates. Very little really ability to control anything inside of Windows Update. The Windows Update for Business is basically controlling machines that are pointing to Windows Update for their updates, their deferrals, if they're not using WSUS or SCCM, so maybe standalone machines or machines that travel very frequently. There's a lot of options here for why that would exist and different options for how to overcome that. WSUS, probably something people are more familiar with. You can control a lot of these with group policy and WSUS. And then SCCM obviously gives you the most flexibility, which we'll spend a lot of time in SCCM during the demo to kind of cover what that looks like and all the different pieces you have in play. All right. So before you can even go down the path of putting in the Windows 10 and start playing with the builds, you have to understand if you're ready to upgrade. And there's some things that you can do. Testing is certainly one way, getting your hands on it, giving it to a group. Highly recommend that. But there's taking this idea of the Windows deployment continuous service happening 2 to 3 times a year, to operationalize that within your organization. You can use some tools to help you shortcut some of those learnings, because you have to, given the new cadence for Windows 10. So one of the tools that you can use is OMS, the Operations Management Suite. You can use basically the Upgrade Readiness solution that is built in OMS. It integrates with SCCM. And basically what you do is you deploy out the telemetry data, where the telemetry data is rather sent, into your OMS subscription, and you get things like if the machines are ready to upgrade and what applications are known applications to have issues. We're going to spend some time in the OMS portal because that's really where it's managed at. It does integrate with SCCM, but more so it's managed in the portal where you get a bulk of the data out. And we'll talk about how to export lists, maybe for targeting different deployments if you're in a larger organization, et cetera. So we'll take a look at that demo. And so really, without further ado, I want to get into the demo to kind of look at some of these tools and to get some hands-on with this. So let's talk about the demo a little bit. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about SCCM, the OMS portal. Let me get this all filled out here. There we go. So we'll go through the OMS portal. We'll talk about that upgrade readiness solution. We can talk about how to deploy it and integrate it with SCCM. We'll look at what it looks like inside of SCCM, the integration from the OMS component. Then we'll take a look at the Windows 10 servicing node and try to demystify that a bit. Take a look at the dashboard, set up a servicing plan. And fundamentally, we're going to talk about the differences between a servicing plan and just using a task sequence, right? So hopefully I'll be able to clarify when you would want to use each. And I've been asked a lot about, is it better to use one over the other? And unfortunately, it's a standard consulting answer, which is it depends. I see a lot of mixed environments to where you would use the servicing plan in conjunction with an upgrade task sequence. And there's a variety of different reasons you'd want to do that. And so let's jump into it and cover that. So let's start in the OMS portal. So if this is your first look at OMS, what I've done here is enabled a solution And I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I do want to show you that this is a cloud-based service in Azure that uses the compute in Azure to give you a lot of analytics at the fingertips with connections into SCOM, connections into SCCM, so that your data can be ported into your tenant, your private tenant, and really get a lot of information out of it. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time looking at the solutions, just know that there's a lot that exists, things like AD assessments, SQL assessments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go back home and let's take a look. I've enabled what's the demo environment for the readiness because the model environment is not very exciting to look at. So I thought, well, let's enable the demo mode so we can look at some actual data that exists here, okay? So what we have is we have some solutions here and a flow from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So we have 10,000 computers, 5,000 of them have been upgraded, 33,000 applications. We have 62 computers with incomplete data, some outdated KVs. So basically just a quick hit of information about the environment that's providing the data behind the scenes here. And so if you look at the upgrade analytics, or upgrade readiness rather, of what you want to do, this is all about your applications and drivers and compatibility, okay? So first thing you want to do is inventory all your applications. And so we have the ability to prioritize applications. So we have applications that are not reviewed, and then we have a lot of them that have low install count, meaning it's probably a minimal impact. Once you have all of your applications, then we can look at applications with known issues, or applications with known fixes, or applications that have known issues and resolutions to those issues. So there's a lot of different ways to cut up the data. And so before it gets any more confusing, let's go take a look at some of this data. So just like anything inside of OMS, you can look at the raw data feeding the record. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a filter on this. And we're going to filter this on issue. And so we can say, let's look at all the applications where there's a known issue that we need to reinstall the application after upgrading, okay? In our environment. To make it a little bit more usable, let's take a look at this view. All right, so here we have a couple of applications that have known issues that need to be reinstalled after the operating system has been upgraded. We have things like Network Monitor, the SSL Network Extender from Checkpoint, et cetera. So again, this is all demo data, but it gives you an idea of how many total installs this application has, right? So the Network Monitor 3.4 of this version has 159. And what we can do here is we can actually mark how important that is to our organization, right? So we can say this is important, business critical, mission critical, best effort, or ignore. And you can start categorizing these applications and keep this data over time. So when I mentioned, when we were on the slide where, I had mentioned that there's a first pass at filtering these applications, right? So before we ever get to the testing phase, we can identify that Network Monitor 3.4.2350 is going to need to be reinstalled. So if I take a look at that, sure. I think that helps out a little bit. So if I take a look at, the application, maybe I mark the importance of it in the organization. What does that tell me if I need to reinstall it, right? What that really means to us is that, I'm trying to get it a little bit bigger so people can see some of the data. What that really means is that if we try to do an automatic upgrade, you are going to be certain that that application is going to have an issue, right? We know that there's a known fix for it, and the known fix is to reinstall. So if you were to take a look at that and decide, well, do I want to do a Windows 10 servicing plan, or do I want to do an upgrade task sequence? The task sequence in this case might be a better option because you could uninstall the app before you ever upgraded the OS and then reinstall the app once the OS has been upgraded, right? So with the Windows 10 test plan, that's not necessarily an available option. It's much more of a Windows update deployment that you'd be doing. And so when you start thinking in how to operationalize this in your environment, you have to think in terms of, well, what are the applications going to? So not that that's not going to work, because it does work. It's that it's not going to work after the upgrade, right? And so coming in here and actively managing this with either a test plan or test results or the importance in your organization, it's certainly something you can build over time as life goes on and as you mark things as mission critical or business critical. Those are the applications you're going to want to look at immediately. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to have all that data or that Microsoft's going to have all that data for you to look at and parse through. That would be a wonderful, magical world, but that's just not going to be the case. A lot of times you're going to get an unknown on it, but you're able to at least mark your telemetry data in a point of authority up here in Azure and then kind of manage it from there ongoing. Let me pull up my notes here to make sure that I'm not missing anything. All right. So again, you have all the features of OMS to be able to filter and carve out, and then you can export to an Excel spreadsheet or to a CSV, and then you can use that as your PowerShell kind of feed, let's say, to do your deployments. And so there's many other types of data that you can just kind of get out of this information. There's a view for drivers that need review, drivers with known issues, checking with vendor. You can mark and kind of manage some of the active pieces that might prevent a successful rollout here in OMS. You also have the ability to deploy to eligible computers and computer groups. May not necessarily be where you'd want to do that. I tend to use this more for the analytics piece of it over here, but know that you can do it. And so this is all fed telemetry data. This is the demo environment, but we do have this stood up in models environment on our production SCCM, which my team loves it when I use the production SCCM for stuff. And so if we go into our upgrade readiness, we can see a couple of things, right? So this is against the collection of all systems, which is not the collection I want to go against. I want to go against ready to upgrade. Or maybe I want to go against, let's do something different. Let's go to all Windows 10. All right. So all the Windows 10 machines that are reporting to our SCCM environment, you can see most of them have been upgraded. There's a couple that are ready to upgrade. I can click on that and go see which ones are ready to upgrade. You can see their old activity. They're probably not ready to upgrade any longer, just haven't fallen out of our environment. But from the extent of the data that you're going to get from the OMS piece, there's not a whole lot of interaction to do. Most of that is going to be managed from OMS. At least that's where it is probably the easiest to manage it from. Another way to look at some of this data here is if we go to the software library, and we take a look at the Windows 10 servicing node. This is another good view of data from SCCM that you can get. And when you look at this data, it's a little bit more granular, maybe a little more tactical, maybe a little bit more useful. But you can see how many versions of 1607 you have. I have 3. I have 6 of 1703, 1 of 1511, right? If we scroll down on this dashboard, you can see that we have 1507 is going to end of life. It ended of life in March. And then 1511 should end of life here somewhere soon, is the assumption. And you can see that we have a little bit of information, and they make a very big disclaimer down here that this should not be your only source of information, which I find to be a little humorous, but it is a good kind of sanity check of where things are at for the current version of Windows. And so when we take a look at Windows 10 and deploying the upgrades for, before you can ever get started, whether you choose an automatic deployment through a Windows 10 servicing plan and a Windows update, or you're going to do through a task sequence, it's good to break your machines up into groups and maintain those groups in consistency, okay? Again, no right or wrong way here. I've created a Windows 10 servicing folder here, and you can see that I have my groups that I've laid out for just a couple of management pieces. Again, you'd probably want to standardize some of the names. You may want to change the locations for it, etc. But for our purposes, I have a test, a pilot group, production group 1 through 3, and a final group that you would want to fill in those buckets long before you ever went down the path of actually doing the tactical work of putting this together. It's a lot of business analytics that you want to put together. Certainly, I'm sure you know the good users and the easy users in your environment to work with, right? The good news about doing something like this is it's very controlled. The bad news is it could be a scheduling nightmare. Again, if you think back to the slides, you could just have a production group and have just a single collection that everybody's deployed to, and they're going to get it 65 days out, and you communicate everything out, right? Again, I cannot stress enough the over communication here and getting your users used to this new concept might be right for your organization. I know a lot of folks like to do things behind the scenes with SCCM. It could become difficult, even more so over time to schedule with those users. But in either case, you need to create the collections for how you're going to deploy things first, right? So let's go take a look at the servicing plan option. So the servicing plan option, we're going to look at all the Windows updates that this is going to be filtered on just the upgrades to Windows for Windows 10. And this option here only applies to Windows 10. So when you deploy these, they only deploy on top of Windows 10, okay? And so you see that there's a whole bunch of updates in here as I continually scroll through, and nobody's marked required. So let's go ahead and create a servicing plan that would get us to where we need to go. Right click, create servicing plan. Call this one test group IT, right? We're just gonna create a little group here, bind it to our collection for our Windows 10 servicing. And then our deployment ring. So we get to decide how much we want, how frequently we want this to deploy. So release ready or business ready. And again, keep in mind that this terminology, I believe, has been completely deprecated and it comes to semi-annual release now, but you'll see this in a lot of the tools. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say it's release ready because we wanna learn new features and we wanna wait 5 days till after it's been released, and then we're gonna go ahead and move forward with it. And then what I'm gonna do is find where it's required is greater than 1. And I should be able to do a preview. And I get 2 options here. I get 1607 and 1703 because those are our 2 current versions. Good news is it'll figure out which version it needs to go down. But if you wanted to be explicit about it, you could say title contains 1703. New preview. How many is it going to download? It's going to deploy exactly 1 update, right? So for our case, maybe that's okay. We want to prep this update to download it. Based on client local time, this should look very familiar if you're an SCCM person. When do you want the deployments to be available? When do you want to put the deadline? So if this is to IT admins, maybe the communication is this is going to be available immediately upon release, and this is going to be forced at the deadline. Give it some user experience. This should all look very, very common. We're going to hide all the software because this is an automatic deployment. We're going to select our deployment rule. The good thing about recording the video is if I move too fast, you can always watch it in slow motion on YouTube. And we go down, we finish out the deployment. It creates the software update group. It provisions the deployment, puts it in the deployment package, and deploys it out, right? So that's very easy to manage from an end user perspective. The hard part about that is you don't have any ability to control what happens before or after the update. It just starts deploying, right? You have a little bit of the user experience. Do you want them to see a notification or not, like a standard update? But maybe that's not how you want to handle things. Maybe you want to handle things with, I need to uninstall Network Monitor first, and then I need to install the update, and then I need to reinstall the Network Monitor. That'd be more of a task sequence kind of functionality. But before we do that, I do want to show you the Windows Update for Business Policy node, which allows you to create a policy for, say, turnkey. And so in this case, you would probably manage this in WSUS or SCCM, or you would manage it through group policy for the deferrals. But let's say you had your devices being managed by some other update mechanism, but they did have SCCM clients on them. Then you could certainly put in the branch readiness level and the deferrals, pause the feature updates starting at certain dates, so you could kind of control how updates are applied, even if you're using some other mechanism like Windows Update and not WSUS inside of an organization. So you create the policy and then you can deploy the policy. and you can do some remediation on it to auto set the keys back. One of the things to note is that I don't remember of which version it is, but to tell if you're a Windows Update for Business or if you're using WSUS for Windows updates, you can take a look at Resource Explorer. There's a new node there. This is a fun little piece of info. If you go into Resource Explorer and scroll down to Windows Update, you should see Use WSUS, WU Server 1 or 2. If it's a 2, you have Windows Update for Business enabled with deferrals kind of running it, and it's getting some other update mechanism. If you're set to a 1, you're using WSUS. So you can create collections off of that and manage that differently. I thought that was an important piece to note. Okay, so I know we're collapsing down on our time here, so I want to get through it so we can get through questions. So that's kind of the Windows 10 servicing node. You create these servicing plans and you can create them for any number of groups that you want, but you are limited in the sense of it's just like an update. You're deploying it and you're moving on with your life. Maybe that's how you want to handle your organization. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But what I will say is, unless you're confident that all your applications are going to upgrade, then you're going to want to use a task sequence or have some kind of process to go through and define those different pieces. And so this is a standard upgrade task sequence, okay? It's literally a right click. I want to create an operating system upgrade. This is a little bit more labor intensive to where you have to download the bits, the ISO, and you provide it the operating system, and then it'll kind of fill in a little bit of the rest. But what you can do here is prepare for the upgrade. You could uninstall things. You could have things pop up. You could do a whole bunch of other things to really manipulate the experience. And then after the post-processing, not only install the updates, but maybe you want to reinstall, in our case, network monitoring, right? For the operating system, we have a Windows 10 1703 Enterprise Edition operating system loaded in SCCM, and our key is in there. And so from here, it's going to be the upgrade package, and then we simply deploy that to a collection. And before we run out of minutes and get to questions, let's deploy that, shall we? Here, I have a magical Windows 10 environment just popped up. And so if we jump over here to operating systems, I should have the Windows 10 Enterprise 1703. So if you're an end user in your organization and you're going to be doing things either through updates or giving them the option to do it through a task sequence, you can have the little dialog pop open down here. That'll open Software Center. It'll remind them that things are happening. You can go to the operating system tab, click on the operating system, and click install. It's going to say, hey, this is going to install an operating system. It's going to take a few minutes. Are you sure you want to do this, right? So this might be something that in your communication plan is well documented and your users have gone to some kind of training for this so that this doesn't hit them by surprise. Because this will need to be done, again, at least every 18 months. If not in a smaller window than that. So we're going to go ahead and click install, and while that starts installing, let's turn it back to the presentation for questions. So we did that. All right. What kind of questions do you have? Go ahead and type them in the chat, and I'll do my best at answering them. And if I cannot answer them, I will follow up with you after the webinar. As we're waiting for some questions, one thing I want to remind everybody of is when you update your task sequence, or you have an update task sequence, you probably are still doing new builds to some degree. So don't forget to update your WIM and test your new builds, update your task sequence as that runs out so that everything you're deploying is brand new. Within the deployment rings and SCCM, they still use maintenance windows by each collection to deploy. I believe so, and I believe that they're actually deployed as software update maintenance windows, but I'd have to go verify that. Because there is the checkbox to say override the maintenance window for the install and for the restart, Luke. So I'm pretty sure it still adheres to that. I don't think anything's going to trump it unless you say to ignore it. I posted a question in the section below. Oops. Zachary. Looking for your question there, Zachary. All right, so I see, will these slides be available for download? The slides won't, but the YouTube video is available to watch, and there's certainly plugins that allow you to borrow the video permanently. So, yeah, what I would recommend is, feel free to email me and I can give you some of the content if you need some of it, Zachary. My email address is coming up here on the next slide. In fact, I'll just go ahead and forward it all. You bet. Yeah, it's tough to communicate this much messaging in a very small amount of time. Certainly going to change how we do our operations kind of inside of an organization, and it's hard to really communicate it and what the change actually means. But keep in mind that when you get to the point where you're actually deploying Windows 10, if you don't continually deploy it, you won't get updates anymore, which leaves you in a bad, susceptible place and could be violating audits, could be overall just not good. Yeah. Yep. Once it's end of life. So, any other questions? Yesterday I sent you an email to send a few materials regarding whatever series that we provided. I'll have to go check my email. Yesterday was a bit hectic, but I will check my email and I will respond accordingly. You bet. Oh, thank you. So as you're going through and thinking about other things that you want to see or different elements or items that you want to have as a webinar, feel free to reach out and give me some ideas. This was a 4-part series and that was part 4. We have had some interest in doing a couple more parts and deep diving into some other areas. So we're working on making sure that there's enough content for those and that it's something that other folks really want to see. So we'll be communicating that out, and should be hearing from us soon if we decide to go down that road. But if you need anything in the interim, please don't hesitate to reach out.